Good afternoon and welcome. It is with great pleasure that the Associated Student Speakers Program present this afternoon and welcome to our university Mr. Rod Serling. After freelancing with radio networks during student days, Mr. Serling turned his attention to television in 1949. His success there is simply a matter of record. Mr. Serling has received 6 Emmy Awards for Best Dramatic Writing and is the first writer ever to receive the Peabody Award. He is probably best known for the scripts he wrote for original use in the television media, particularly Requiem for a Heavyweight and Patterns. In 1959, he created, wrote, and produced The Twilight Zone. After Mr. Serling's address, there will be an informal coffee hour next door in the men's lounge. Finally, no introduction of our guest today could be complete without mention of his persistent and vocal arguments for this remaining a tuition-free university. Therefore, I present not a stranger, but a friend, Rod Serling.
Thank you very much. I have kind of a low voice, and it strikes me that I'm only hearing myself. Can you hear me in the back of this gigantic room? Can you hear? I'm always delighted and indeed honored to be invited to appear at UCLA, not only as a California citizen who is deeply committed and indeed concerned with higher education, but also by virtue of the fact that I'm a neighbor and live only a few minutes away from you. Drop in any time. Needless to say, I am conscious and most aware of the recent political turmoil that took place a couple of days ago, and am, needless to say, in addition, somewhat preoccupied by it. The other night, Wednesday night, the night immediately following the catastrophe, my wife and I happened to attend the Ed Wynn testimonial dinner on behalf of the Parkinson's disease group, and Bob Crane was the MC. And Bob, incidentally, should you not know it, is a marvelously rich comedian. He's genuinely funny, and he told us a story, apocryphal perhaps, but nonetheless I thought quite humorous, that he had only met Ronnie Reagan once in his entire life, and that was when he first started shooting his series. And he was told to go to a certain sound stage at one of the motion picture studios and take a dressing room which was marked 1C. And by accident, he walked into a dressing room which was 1B. And there sitting in the dressing room was Ronnie Reagan. And Bob Crane was, tremendously embarrassed by having walked in without even knocking. And he put his hand to his head and he said, "Oh my God." And Reagan turned and said, "You better believe it." This was the joke that Crane told us. I generally approach these infrequent excursions back into the academe with a few spasms of trepidation. Most university campuses that I have occasion to visit provide me with an audience of adults, generally as wise as myself, sometimes wiser, usually better read, and something less than my equal only in point of longevity. So it follows that it's normally my custom to try to pick a subject in which I might, through dint of experience and exposure, be more knowledgeable than is my audience. And this, of course, would, of necessity, have to be television, since I've been involved in those vineyards since the very early pioneer days, dating back to 1949. But frankly, television is very much like the weather. Much can be said of it, but very damn little can be done about it. Pat Buttram, I noticed in this morning's paper, said that he loved commercials because at least he knew they wouldn't be interrupted. And lately, I've been doing a bit of reflecting, since professionally I've been what is euphemistically known as in this business as at liberty. That is to say, not working. This, of course, is really not the unhappiest state of affairs because it does give a man a chance to think a little bit, and that's been pretty much the extent of my activities of late. I've had a Broadway play on the market for the better part of the last year, and I've been sort of waiting in limbo to see if anyone would buy it. As a matter of fact, it does give me an opportunity to watch television on occasion, and I depart from these prepared comments only to share with you the experience that I've had the past 6 months of watching daytime television, and an experience which up to 6 months ago had been denied me. And I've been quite taken with the nature of the television commercials, not to say appalled. And there's a woman who runs around on your little cathode tube whose name is Katie Winters. Now, Katie Winters has a unique place in the escutcheon of our social order because all her friends, 1,900 of them, have underarm perspiration problems. Then I note with interest a commercial of a rental car in which a guy jumps off of a 9-story building and lands headlong into an automobile. And I believe that if on one errant occasion he chances to land on a stick shift, he will then know what is the meaning of Hertz. These unquestionably are the jokes. As a matter of fact, in addition, we had a census taker at my home not too long ago, and my 14-year-old daughter greeted him at the door, and he asked her what her father did or currently was doing for a living. And without batting an eye, this kid, who I'm sure will ultimately wind up writing for Bob Hope 10 years hence, announced to him that Daddy was engaging in his latest hobby. He was lying in the hammock and letting the birds watch him. Well, actually, as of November the 9th, I haven't been lying in a hammock exactly. I've been pretty much on the floor, in a state of shock, as have many of my liberal colleagues. So I'm afraid I really can't confine myself to the banalities of either television or the proscenium in terms of drama or the printed page. Rather, what I'd like to talk to you about today has to do with certain reflections made over the past 48 hours as a consequence of our recent national and state balloting, and as really a reflection of what are some thoughts of my own apropos of the State of the Union, the predilections of the electorate, and some of the issues that so beat the hell out of most liberals last Tuesday. And I can think of really no better place to talk politically than a college campus. It strikes me that you college students are perhaps the most politically oriented species of Americans who exist. And whereas college campuses are perhaps the last places on earth a man should go with political opinions nowadays, I do so with some temerity because on the basis of the size of the honorarium you've given me, I really have no obligation to ingratiate any of you. So what follows are things that are near and sometimes dear to my heart. Some observations about current morality, a couple of asides about what are the things that buoy up my hopes, and conversely, what are some of the things that make me bleed to death. First of all, there's this business of the so-called white backlash and the preoccupation we've seen with the riots in various parts of our country. I suppose if we were to semantically search for a definition of white backlash, we might say that it's simply a self-righteous majority taking a most unrighteous position. And this position is found on two polarized points of the spectrum of race relations. There are the militant whites who look at a rioting Negro and who sagely make the philosophical point that this proves what they've been saying all along, that the Negroes were somehow a lesser breed of cat who could not be trusted with either political freedom, economic opportunity, or the prerogatives that go along with citizenship. And as a corollary to that, they point a warning finger or fist, depending on the region, to the Negro. And they tell him that that's it. The law-abiding, God-fearing, patriotic white American will not countenance the looting and rampage and violence of these marching blacks. And that from now on, that brief and illusory honeymoon that took place in Washington, D.C. in 1964 is over. Now we revert to type. Now we re-embrace those fundamentals that have always been the touchstone of both politics and race relations over the years. The white man is the boss. The black man is a second-rate addenda on the scene, and he forever shall be precisely that. And leave us not hear any more cries for equality, because that equality, too, has been forfeited by the specter of black power and the irresponsibility that that phrase connotes. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we have the parlor liberal, the essentially decent and well-motivated humanitarian who shakes his head and clucks and feels miserable that 1% of the Negro population has taken to the streets. And he waggles a finger at his Negro brethren and he says, "Slow, man, slow. Cool it for a while. Soften your voices. Ease up on your demands. Turn off the Klieg lights and crawl into the shadows." The essential thing now is to allow the frightened white majority time to recast you in your more subservient role, to which the white has become most accustomed and feels most comfortable in. Now, this is the so-called white backlash. And north of the Mason-Dixon line, you don't hear a candidate use that expression. Out here in California, it somehow enters the body politic with a backdoor injection into a vein. And it comes at us via the innuendo and the wise wink. We heard it from the proponents of Proposition 16, who tried to pass the so-called anti-obscenity law. And on the radio, you very likely heard the spot announcements, in which it was pointed out that decent, law-abiding men and women had rights too, and that included the right of their children to lead a reasonably sheltered and protected life during their formative years, free of salacious literature. But perched on top of the sobriquet, quote, decent, law-abiding, unquote, was Jim Crow, plain, simple, and ugly. By decent, law-abiding men and women, they meant white, decent, law-abiding men and women. The inference and the innuendo were very clear. Hey, Mac. They were nudging us. You know what we mean, Mac? We're fighting for the right kind of people. Then the wink again. The white kind of people. Know what we mean, Mac? And in point of fact, putting referendums on ballots, like Proposition 16 and like Proposition 14, which repealed the Rumford Act, were instances of white backlash at its most vicious, virulent, hate-fostering best. It was the shrill and discordant voices of that segment of our society who are altogether willing to honor law and acknowledge justice and indeed embrace morality, but only their brand of all three. And if the law and the lawmakers do not subscribe to their points of view, then we move into the, quote, impeach Earl Warren, unquote, syndrome, in which we are told to throw the rascals out and throw the laws out as well. So desperately afraid are these people of any kind of centralized government, and you hear them bemoan this menacing democratic phenomena constantly. It's odd how quick and how vibrant they are when it comes to a few good federal laws of their own making and their own devices. Well, I believe when we talk of law or justice or morality, we're going to have to consign the so-called white backlash to its proper place. And that would have to be in a city dump someplace outside of Pomona. To the men who say that the Negro has no right to riot and no right to pillage and no right to loot, we must acknowledge that he's right. But let us at the same time make this an all-inclusive attitude and let it apply to all men who would loot and pillage and burn. Let it apply to any and all overt attempts to subvert law and order. Let it, for example, apply to the 6,000-odd lynchings that have taken place against the Negro race between the middle 19th century and 1939. 6,000 recorded lynchings, that is. God knows how many took place that did not find their way into historical statistics. And let us not make this morality of ours so selective as to color. While we talk of Watts and Atlanta and Berkeley and Cleveland, Ohio, let's remember the bomb placed in a Selma, Alabama church. And this was not the act of passion that makes hopeless, anguished people throw bricks in store windows. It was a cold, calculated, predatory, and logistically ordered act of hating men who projected their hate and gave it form to take the lives of 6 innocent Negro kids. Of the two, a mob that races through a ghetto on a hot summer night, or the white man who so carefully plans the taking of human lives, I'm hard-pressed to decide which is the most immoral. But my tendencies are to be much more sympathetic to the marchers than the murderers. What I'm trying to say here is that no one has seen fit to challenge the rights of Italian Americans because there happens to be a Cosa Nostra around, and nobody has entertained the thought of disenfranchising the Southern white because he has a history of violence against the Negro that is as regular as it is appalling. And I saw no public outcry at retaining Texas as a state in the Union when on a November day a young president of the United States was shot down in the streets, and those streets were lined with placards supplied by the Dallas Birch Society which said, "Wanted for treason, JFK." It's incredible, this selective morality which would disenfranchise the Negro because of the 1% who violate the law, and yet ascribe no such racial stigma to the white man who's been doing far worse for a hell of a lot longer time. It makes no sense and it serves no purpose. Now, as to the other end of the spectrum, which is my end of the spectrum, because I've fallen prey to this myself, the emotional reaction to what happened in Oakland and everywhere else. I instinctively hold up my hands and I turn to my Negro friends, who are legion, and I say, for God's sakes, cool it. Will you slow down? Don't ask for your rights so stridently or so continuously or so demandingly. You're hurting your own cause. Now this is specious, and it is without logic, and above all, it is without justice. Who are we, any of us, to tell the Negro to slow down in his demands for the things which are his due, his right, his legacy? Who are we to hold out equality in employment, and equality in education, and equality in living conditions, like a kind of a small country club golf trophy, and say, you'll get it in good time, or you'll get it if you're a good boy, or you'll get it if you're more deferential, or perhaps less noisy about it? In all truth, these are rights which properly are not ours to give. They already exist. They're a matter of record. The truth is that all this equality belongs to the Negro. We've simply not given it to him. We have not extended it to him. We never really made it a matter of record that by everything right and holy it's his to begin with. I frankly think we've run out of alternatives now. Either we ultimately must face the fact that we're going to have to live side by side with our neighbors, or we're going to have to carve this land up into ghetto gradations. There isn't a middle ground anymore. And so long as we deny anything to anyone, there will be more Watts, and more Atlantas, and more Harlems, and more of everything else. There isn't a racial group, or a political party, or a national entity who historically will not ultimately take to the streets when they are denied so long and too long what belongs to them. I'm not condoning the breaking of store windows, or the burning of buildings, or the destruction of property. There's no question but that it does hurt the cause. There's no question but that it damages the image of our Negro citizen. I wish to hell they wouldn't march. I wish to hell they'd make it easy for us liberals to be patient, if not acquiescent, all the time. But everything inside me that has to do with principle and honor and ethics dictate that I not turn my back on the legitimate aspirations of a people because they run out of patience and run out of acquiescence. Crime in the streets is one thing, but the prolonged, continuous crime of the denial of freedom is a more costly and a much more serious departure from justice. Some years ago, when Proposition 14 was first put on the ballot as a public referendum, the so-called open housing clause, I suddenly became acquainted with what are the very special hungers of our California electorate. It seems that on the spectrum of public concern, the right of property carries with it the most import and the most sacred and deified concern. A man, so they tell us, should have the right to dispose of his property in whatever manner he sees fit and to whomsoever he wants to sell it to or give it to or lend it to or rent it to. The right of property. This I was told by men and women who were not rightists or extremists of any kind, but they clutched to this concept as if it were absolutely celestial in origin. I'm not a lawyer. I have only a layman's knowledge and interest in constitutional prerogatives, and I'll admit to a certain emotional stance in my reaction to this. But I must tell you that I think the preeminent dignity of the human being should be a matter of far more import and should be an object of much deeper concern than is the right to sell property. Again, as in the case of white backlash, our real estate people out here will never say that to be against the Rumford Act is suggestive of any prejudice. As a matter of fact, they protest far too much in this regard. Oh no, they'll tell us there's nothing anti-Negro in this, nothing anti-Semitic, nothing anti-accidental. This happens to be freedom in its purest form. Freedom of property and the freedom to dispose of that property. Now, in theory, I suppose they can boast some constitutional precedents. But realistically, Proposition 14 was a blatant and predatory and overt acknowledgement of prejudice. I must speak emotionally now because this deals with emotions, and the most basic emotions. I note that 23% of the fatalities in Vietnam are colored soldiers, a percentage, incidentally, which is as totally overlooked in terms of its incredible size as is the smallness of the 1% who riot. But I wonder what this man feels, this Negro soldier, when he knows that whereas he has an obligation to wear the uniform and to die in extravagant numbers, far disproportionate to the Negro population, I wonder if he ever becomes preoccupied in the realization that the cause that he fights for, according to our rights-conscious white brethren, will deny him the housing of his choice. They will deny him. They will quote statutes to him and the Constitution to him and certain God-given rights that have to do with property. This they'll quote to him. But they will, with the benefit of law, quite legally, consign him to a ghetto for the rest of his life, no matter his sacrifices and no matter in what numbers he has to die. I don't deny that property rights are of the essence, but I submit to you that there are other rights, perhaps less clear, that transcend the house and some plaster and so many square feet of yard. These have to do with the rights of men to live where they want, to live where they can afford to, and to live without jeopardy. I sometimes am bemused by the so-called new left that I run up against on campuses. I'm bemused because I'm accustomed to the political right wing disliking me with great cordiality. This has been the case over the years, and I'm accustomed to it. But when young men and women whose attitudes and motives are closer to my own start to wave banners in my face, this becomes a little unnerving, because I'd always thought we were kind of on the same team. It appears on occasion that we play in the same league, but we're not on the same team. These very liberally oriented students disdain both me and the Bird Society. They slough us off with a kind of plague on both your houses approach. They rarely, however, supply blueprints for a particular house of their own. They love to take belts at existing authority, rejecting it, ridiculing it, tearing it to pieces. But I've yet to see any alternatives beyond sloganry and beyond their passion. They make an exceptionally strong case for academic freedom, but they do so almost in the abstract. They do not take the next step in the natural progression of logic and tell us academic freedom for what, or to do what, or to accomplish what. They cry out for democracy and indeed the democratic process, but they do so while embracing a strangely anarchistic approach that is the antithesis of the democratic process. But I will say this: I would much prefer, repeat, much prefer, some bearded marchers and a few exponents of dirty words and a loud vocal group of dissenters, no matter the cause, to what were the extracurricular functions of most college students during my undergraduate days. In the halcyon pre-war time, college students went all out for relatively major causes, like eating goldfish alive, raiding panties in girls' dormitories, or packing themselves into phone booths, 76 at a time, to see who'd remain unasphyxiated. Let me suggest that these all-out probes of my time into the social ills of the world were a whole hell of a lot less inspired than are the commitments of your generation, be you on the left or the right. So in point of fact, I care less that you're somewhat disorganized on occasion and somewhat directionless in your causes, so long as you embrace causes and commit to causes and involve yourselves in causes. I fault you really not in that you're so devoid of alternatives, but simply because all this marvelous energy of yours, all of this unparalleled enthusiasm, might possibly be put to better and more thoughtful and more resultant uses. But even so, God help us if your voices are stifled, if your thought processes are dulled, if the courage it takes for you to take unpopular positions is somehow jeopardized. The salvation of this country, and indeed the salvation of the institutions that we hold precious and basic, is dependent on your capacity to make your commitments and to bespeak them. And since this is kind of a department store potpourri of thought, let me make mention of one of the major issues on the Ohio State campus a few years ago, which under this new administration might well be a problem here: the business of communist speakers, or indeed any kind of politically suspect lecturers appearing on publicly supported campuses. I've always felt that the denial of a platform to even the most rabid of enemies is somehow a tacit admission that the point of view espoused by that enemy carries with it some weight of logic that we must be fearful of, if indeed his voice has to be stifled by an official directive. I seriously doubt if a communist or a Nazi could come up with so winning a collection of fact and opinion that he would make any substantial inroads on a college audience. But once you deny him that platform, there is most assuredly an innate suggestion that he is to be feared because of his logic and because of the positions he takes. And I don't believe this is the case. My guess is rather that most ideologies that call for omnipotent governments and monolithic governing structures are by their nature an anathema to those of us who respect freedom. And because I like to put my money where my mouth is, I would extend that freedom of this platform to almost anyone, so long as he didn't yell fire in the crowded theater. And I suppose this would pretty much run the gamut of the kookiest of political thought in this country, practically down to Rockwell and his Nazis as well. Let them speak. Let's hear what they say. Usually I find that they damn themselves. And now that I've bespoken of evils and ills and wrongdoings and injustices, let me close by offering not the universal cathartic that will somehow cure us all, but let me suggest that whereas this is not the best of all possible worlds, its potential remains quite intact. And I think this potential stems from the very thing we've been discussing, the business of talking out, of dissenting, of arguing, and rebutting. That's the universal language, speech, dialogue, communication. Therein lies the hope, communication. That's the highway between men's minds that guarantee as long as men talk, they will not fight. And as long as they do not fight, they survive. So I would leave you with this thought. Don't stop talking. And don't stop thinking. And don't, for God's sake, stop arguing. There's an apocryphal story they tell that shortly after Samuel Morse laid the first transatlantic cable, he delivered a message to the continent of Europe from New York City. And an excited student rushed into a crowded Eastern classroom, and he shouted at the top of his lungs that Samuel B. Morse had just talked to Europe over the cable. And there was a general commotion, full of cheering and applause and back-pounding, and an elderly white-maned professor who had remained quietly observant of the scene looked up and said very softly, "What did he say?" And this is of the essence. What do we say? This and the fact that we keep saying. We keep talking, we keep arguing. We keep espousing our own causes. On a given election day of a given year or even a given century, this may seem to be on the face of it divisive. But over the long haul, and when I say long haul, I mean the ultimate destiny of this country and this earth, no people, no race, no country, and no civilization ever died from too much talk, too much divided opinion, too many variances of view. Thank you very much.
I'm sure that the size of your applause has indicated that you are prepared now to do some talking and for some talking more directly with Rod Serling. We will be in a few minutes next door in the men's lounge. Please join us for that. Thank you.
What if they all show up?
When we had Mark Twain, we had 600 people jammed in there. Oh, he's really fun.
Really space.
Can we have that tonight? 4 years now, listening to speeches with
Wonderful.
I've never heard of
really,
an audience.
We're sitting here saying, I couldn't imagine how someone could sit down and write on those.
I've never seen
Secretary sits down and writes that.
I've never seen wow, pin drop. Of several weeks ago, and I imagine we'll have a spokesman for Outer Limits or something. Anyway, so we have plenty of time. Mr. Serling is going to be here until 2 o'clock, and I hope that we can get to as many of your questions as we can. If you have a question, please raise your hand, try to shout it out. If someone can't hear a question, put your hand up and we'll start to use this and repeat it. If not, I think it would be convenient for Mr. Serling to speak without the microphone. So someone start it off. Yes, sir.
I haven't seen any of her latest pictures, but you're not gonna, I can't possibly respond to a question like that since I've never tried it. Have you? I'm not trying to put you on, really. You mean socially, whether I think it's acceptable or that sort of thing, or do I get kicks, or what's the point of the question? Pardon me? Marijuana legalized? I seriously doubt it, if indeed what the medical men tell me is true, that it leads to yet exposure to other drugs which might be more serious. If that indeed is true, I would take a dim view of legalizing marijuana. Besides, it's very expensive. Thank you. I'll meet you outside, young man. We'll take a drag together. You make it sound like that's some sort of stigma. Yes, pridefully I say I'm a homeowner. Me and the Gibraltar Building and Loan. Yes, I am indeed. Why? Was the point of the question related to the tax thing? Oh, well, I'm not that close a neighbor, to tell you the truth. I live in Vincennes, Indiana. What I meant was, by being a neighbor. No, I know. I live in the Palisades, which is far afield of here. Why, I gather, is there some current controversy about parking around here?
The Palisades may be lot 45 before before it's all
They
over.
may be having classes in my basement before the month is out, I'm sure.
Next Tuesday.
God, isn't it uncomfortable standing in this smoke-filled room? Yes, sir. Interesting question. Thank you. I'm not at all knowledgeable on that, though it's a very moot point. I'm deeply concerned about it. I noted in the paper this morning in terms of a transcript of the current meeting between Rafferty and the acting president of the Education Board. Comment was made by the chairman to Mr. Rafferty. I call him Red, White, and Blue Max. That's what I call him. He and I have had our little tilts of late. Rafferty kept interrupting one of the speakers, and the chairman of the committee of the council pointed a finger at him and said, "Dr. Rafferty, I will not permit, so long as I am, supervising these hearings, to allow you to interrupt any of the people." And Rafferty responded, "Well, that won't be too long." So the inference is quite clear. There's going to be a general house cleaning. I suppose it's very much dependent on which wing of the Republicans takes over in terms of the selection of educational personnel. If indeed it's a Rafferty-oriented thing, I think we're in major trouble. And on that happy note, I'd like to say that...
Yes, sir.
Well, of course, it was the deep concern of the Democratic Party that Governor Brown was not receiving the support that they thought he should receive from the over 21 college graduate students or the faculty, and that there was to be a kind of an 11th hour appeal to the college campuses for precisely that kind of support, because they felt that at this stage of the game, with defeat staring them in the face, and of course I think everyone knew if we were going to take a licking, was that they figured that, all right, to hell with 1966, let's start thinking of 68 and 72 and 76, and wherein is the nucleus of possible political support? No place else but college campuses. This is where you start to literally formulate political opinion and to devise pressure and power groups of enlightened people who will support a more liberal political point of view. But unfortunately, as I say, this was an 11th hour concept which came in too late. And at that stage of the game, nobody thought they were going to win. I really think Pat Brown, who I must tell you, is perhaps not the most prepossessing of men, is not the most articulate. On occasion will take positions for political expediency which we as liberals of necessity must turn our backs on. But I think he's a highly well-motivated man. I think he's a decent man. I think if you examine what have been the social attitudes espoused by Brown over the past 23 years in public life, you would find that by and large they adhere pretty closely to a pretty progressive and enlightened point of view. And I, for one, was desperately sorry to see him leave the arena. That's my particular feeling. I, needless to say, would have loved it if we had a guy who looked like Reagan, who had the brains of John F. Kennedy, and the political awareness of, say, of Jesse Unruh, and the power of an Al Smith, and the rest of it. I wish we could find such a guy. Unfortunately, we're hard-pressed to find them. I note again, parenthetically, that already the Republicans are talking about Chuck Connors. Well, I tell you something, it hurts me that I've never been asked to run for public office because I've got all the proper qualifications. When I was 11 years old, I had a tap dancing routine with a trained monkey. I swear to God, I used to entertain. Now, quite obviously, as a result of the Tuesday election, in considering the nature of politics, though I may not have been asked, that monkey might make it yet. You never can tell. Yes, sir. I was not as shattered in most areas as I was uniquely here in California. I noted that there were two, rabid segregationists who got licked in Maryland and in Oklahoma, was it, or Kansas, where Rockefeller took Johnson. Arkansas. You see, that's right. He's going to come back and take a little political science course here and learn where the states are. I find, Romney hardly a menacing man of any proportion. I was delighted to see Rockefeller take it in New York. And when people who say to me, Rockefeller's a billionaire and, he's so politically oriented and he never takes a position, by God, I think back at that Cow Palace situation in San Francisco when alone this guy stood up and faced probably what was the most viciously anti-audience that anybody could conjure up unless they sold tickets for it. And he stood up and faced them with a degree of courage that it's rather rare, I think. So I was delighted that Rockefeller won. So overall, I was not as disturbed nationally, since it's it's an off year. And every 2 years, I understand, traditionally, we run against this. Yes, ma'am? Probably not. Well, you could cry a little, I guess, to begin with. No, from now on, we rebuild, much as every out party has to do. Needless to say, in the first 48 hours, all you can do is reflect. But over the long haul, the weeks and the months to follow, if indeed you have a preoccupation with a liberal point of view and you want to make yourself heard, and you have ideas as to what should be the makeup of a Democratic Party, how to revitalize it, how to make it associable with the people out here, then you join your Democratic clubs or what all, and you start from scratch. I don't know of any. I realize it's a very negative response. I tell you, I've been gone from universities for so long that I'm not as aware as I should be of what goes on, as to what your thought processes are, as to what literally, are the makeups and the functions of college groups within a campus. I do sense a tremendous political orientation among students nowadays, which was not the case when I was an undergraduate. That was 1916, of course. It was before France. No, in 46, in the post-war years, people were pretty lethargic about the whole goddamn thing. We'd just gone through a terrible war. Most of us were way overage to be students. I was 23, which is awful. First of all, you wear a lot of hair then, and it's hard to put a beanie cap on, when you enter. And in point of fact, really, you want to leave politics behind you, because in every true sense, that's what you've been exposed to for the last several years. So we were not nearly as politically oriented, or indeed as aware as college students are now. This is what buoys me up, really, when I talk to groups like this. Not that they agree with me all the time. Try the University of Wisconsin sometime, for example, or the University of Indiana, or a couple of the schools in which, you don't have letters written to the editor like you did at the Bruin today. And they would never use four-letter Anglo-Saxon words in their newsprint. The whole school would explode if that happened. But even with those students, they are oriented. They have a point of view. And they're thoughtful kids. And there's less prejudice, I think, on college campuses than almost uniquely in any social group, in any political group in the whole world. Boy, in this to me lies the hope and the salvation right here. Yes, ma'am. They tell me it's going to be Lynch, but of course, this is by virtue of the fact that he's alone in the woods now. There's nobody around, and, outside of Smokey the Bear, who do you get? Lynch, I find, is a hell of a nice man and a very well thought of man and can be a most effective man, but he's, he doesn't look like Reagan, he doesn't talk like any of them, and politically, I doubt very much if we can rally around him unless we rally around his brain. But where is the spokesman? Where is that articulate and attractive guy who can wave the banner and people gather around? That's what we got to find. I wish we had a Finch. I swear I do. Not just the Finch, but a guy like Finch.
Do you think it would have been Schley, what with the air of Kennedy, etc.? If he would have won, do you think that with his ability to speak, good looks, etc., he would have been a new man? Pardon me for using my prerogative.
Which Kennedy are we talking about, Art? You mean if Brown had looked like Kennedy, you mean?
No, Norbert Schley.
Norman Schley. What does Norman Schley look like? I have to pose the question. I've never seen him.
Looks like a nice guy.
No, I seriously doubt really in this election, if they came out looking like Gable at age 25, they could have done very much with it. We were doomed. There's no question about it. I don't think we'd have been doomed in most states because I think the issues are too much in the foreground there. In this state, it's an election of personalities, of emotion, of tried and true prejudices and the rest of it. And nobody can tell me that the white backlash didn't have a very definite bearing on this election. Yes, ma'am. I seriously doubt that, because in point of fact, the viewpoints espoused by both Brown and Reagan, insofar as the Vietnam situation is concerned, were hard-pressed to distinguish. They were both the same. I couldn't perceive any real protest vote, except perhaps in the Hatfield campaign, in which I think, to my knowledge, was the only one of a high office election in which the issue even was broached. I don't know. I tell you, that's another thing. And of course, it takes you hours to go into the various ramifications of what are the major issues of the time. But this is what destroyed me in this election. The fact that Vietnam was not an issue, either pro or con. Here you're losing 100 men a week in what appears to be a gigantic disposal. And it now relates itself to arithmetic. We don't think of the loss of life. We think of it arithmetically. We killed 119 and a half of them, and our losses were, quote, light, which now must be the euphemism of all time, because we only suffer light losses, and yet at the end of every month there's 213 names and 700 names and 400 names, and we keep dying off. And to what end? That's my concern, and the fact that nobody gets up and protests really on a high level, or indeed that the American people don't respond in some way and say, wait a minute, hold off a second. All right, we will die, because we're quite accustomed to that. We've had 11 major wars in a relatively brief span of history. But why are we dying? To what end? Who wants us there? Who beckons to us to remain there? And who indeed is the enemy? Now, if they could answer those questions, and if the populace asked the questions, I'd feel a little bit better by it. Yes, sir. What I consider Moriarty would not be publishable even in the Daily Bruin, my friend. Moriarty and I have done everything but engage in letters to the editor of the LA Times. That's usually the ultimate in combat, boy. But Moriarty knows where I stand. I'm sure he could care less. But I find him, number one, a demagogue. Number two, unprincipled. Number three, well, now we get into the four-letter Anglo-Saxon words, and we simply can't do that. I find him a totally unwholesome individual. I think he's an asset to no one. And I'll tell you, quite apart from the fact that he quotes fascist sheets in trying to, hoist Brown on a petard, is the fact that after Watts, not once did the mayor of the city of Los Angeles ever walk into the street in Watts, California, and take a look or a listen or feel anything as to what must be the collective anguish of a group of people who would do what they did. Now, they don't do it because they like to throw bricks. Oh, I'm sure a segment of them like to throw bricks. A segment of people in this room like to throw bricks. I mean, you'll find that no matter where you go. But there is obviously an underlying current ailment that must feed on these people and force them to take to the streets. Well, where was Yorty when the question was not even asked? This is what so disturbs me about the man. I loved it when Kennedy got a hold of him in the subcommittee there. And Mary Yorty bridled because he's unused to this kind of thing, and he said, Senator, you don't have to tell me how to run the city of Los Angeles. That's what he said to Kennedy. He didn't say it quite that well, of course.
What are some of your own impressions of President Johnson?
I have a terribly mixed feeling about the man. I look back at some of the speeches, particularly those which have to do with what he feels were certain social ramifications of the Great Society program. I read his speeches in support of civil rights. I read speeches made below the Mason-Dixon line by Johnson, which were quite unusual for a politician, particularly a Texan. And I think to myself, obviously the man has something. Now, whether or not he believes it, and whether or not he is genuinely and sincerely motivated to say these things, I don't know. But I can't dismiss him out of hand because of the Vietnamese thing. I suppose a lot of you think I should. I have to withhold my total impression of the man until, the end of office. I cannot, I can't get up on my feet and scream with pleasure at the fact that he occupies the White House. I cannot do that in conscience. And there are a few American presidents during my lifespan that I could. One of them, I think, would have been Adlai Stevenson had he ever run, if he had ever won. Certainly John F. Kennedy in the last year. I realize there is this aura of, celestial greatness that would attend properly any young man so tragically shorn of life at that given moment. And I suppose we are distorted, perhaps, in our recollections of the man. But my recollections do call for a picture of a gracious man and a wise man and a temperate man, insofar as Kennedy was concerned. And I think potentially this might have been the great American president. I'm not sure. But I rather think so. You don't agree with me?
I did.
Oh, but the other man's shaking his head.
No, I think he was
Destined to be killed?
yes, I believe it was that.
Boy, I wouldn't subscribe to that view for any American.
He was, I feel that he was good at all roles. That he spoke a bigger and he was in
They can't hear you.
he was too fast.
Too fast for his time, you mean? And yet, boy, he provided a legacy for Lyndon Johnson. The 90% of the basis of the whole, domestic program of Lyndon Johnson is simply a... Well, in most social and economic areas, he was indeed, was he not? Oh, well, let's not get into a big argument because that's belaboring it. Yes, ma'am. As a presidential candidate, I don't think 68's the time. I seriously doubt it. I think it's going to be Johnson's ball game all over again. Well, I suppose you'd probably have to pose the question to a political science professor, but unless I'm mistaken, that every incumbent has it going his way when he runs, with the possible exception of Harry Truman in '48. I think that's literally, what is the ritual of American politics, that in the off year, the out party comes in, but the incumbent president 2 years later nonetheless has it going more his way. Yes, sir. Oh, indeed. No question about it. If, for example, we are mired in Vietnam in precisely the same manner in which we are today, and the Republicans put up Romney and Reagan, I think it'll be Romney and Reagan. And don't laugh, because in 1968, remember, you read it here first like Hedda Hopper. In 2 years from now, if the situation is roughly the equivalent of what it is today, I venture to say you'll see a Romney-Reagan slate. And man, that's going to be a toughie. That's when we run, I think, probably Gene Kelly. He dances much better. And that kind of thing. Yes. I'd like not to respond to that, if I may. Okay? Yes, ma'am. Admitting Red China to the UN, I think, indeed, what the hell? What if we turn our backs and say they're going to disappear? I think it's ridiculous. And in point of fact, I can't understand what is the position of the Defense Department in terms of the recent nuclear explosion and missile of the Red Chinese. Here, 3 things must be taken into account. Number 1, they have cheaply developed an international continental ballistics missile. They have made the nuclear warhead sufficiently small to put on the missile. They've miniaturized it, which in itself is an incredible task and one hell of an accomplishment. And number 3, they've blown it up over Chinese territory, so they've perfected the safety device to that extent that they can blow it up. Now, this suggests to me that we are up against a nuclear power now, that carries with it, some great deal of tension. And yet McNamara said 4 weeks ago that it'll take years for them to develop, a ballistics missile that could conceivably be thrown anywhere. And then like 48 hours later, they blow it up. I yield to no man in my respect for Secretary of Defense McNamara, but I sometimes wonder, Yes, sir. Well, I must tell you, I don't subscribe to the view that by virtue of being an actor should automatically disenfranchise you from possibly seeking public office. My concern, of course, is not that he's an actor per se, but that to hell with being an actor, does he know what he's about? Has he ever had any experience in governing? What are his philosophical political views? What sort of background does the man have? Now, in terms of Regan, we were exposed to a phenomena, a glib man who claims to have been, the president of the Screen Actors Guild, which in point of fact he was, but was never a very damn good president. If anything, and even at the time when you asked most actors, this guy was thought to be a company man, and forever a company man. And he was not representative of really trade union. And also the Screen Actors Guild is hardly a union, in terms of the way we think of unions anyway. All the business, the clothes shop, has no meaning to the Screen Actors Guild, and most of the other little nuances that attend labor unions are not applicable to actors and writers guilds because they're professional guilds, not really a union. So in point of fact, Regan's association with labor was a very temporal thing at best. Well, beyond that, what other qualifications did Ronald Reagan have to be governor of the most populous state in the Union? Well, I could find a magnifying glass. I still couldn't discover it. I don't know how the hell this man can run for public office. Now, in point of fact, Steve Allen would have roughly the same problems going for him. And again, indeed, my emotions dictate that I accept Steve Allen because he's a friend, and number two, because I think he thinks properly. He's a sensitive man and a compassionate man. But again, I have to ask myself, sure, he's sensitive, he's compassionate, he thinks the way I do, and he's a nice guy, and I like to have him over to my house for dinner. But what are his qualifications for the Senate of the United States? I have to pose the question, and it would be the question I'd pose to any candidate. Yes, sir. Oh, don't even say that, buddy, will you? Is there any way we can stop him? Not at all. Not at all. The Yorty wing of the Democratic Party is as militant and well-organized and tough to beat as there is in the state. And I would guess probably that what we're going to suffer now for the next couple of years, unless we, get off the dime somehow, is that we will have a Democratic Party not unlike the Tammany machine in New York City. Yes, ma'am. I wish to God he could. I'm not sure he can. Either Art or Len mentioned to me today that they felt that Kuechel would never even try to run in a primary again, a Republican primary, because he's doomed. And Tom Kuechel is one hell of a man, too. Well, that's the other problem, you see. Then you've got the Yorty group to contend with. What do I think about it? Yes, I do indeed. I think if Kuechel runs in as an independent and does it properly, and the Democrats are, carefully aware of this and refrain from putting up a candidate, as they might very likely do, as in the case of the Warren time, when both major parties, subscribed to one candidacy. I think the same thing might happen. Yes, ma'am. Well, oddly enough, I guess the election of Mr. Brooke was, in a strange way, almost a white backlash in itself, insofar as his dedicated opposition to the Stokely-Carmichael faction. But I'm delighted anyway, I must tell you. For a Negro to come into the Senate, which is his right and due and long overdue at that, to me carries with it a buoyant collection of hopes that there is a Negro in the Senate of the United States. Only one, mind you, but there he is. And to me that carries with it an emotional, very positive feeling. Yes, ma'am. Democrats don't comment on the Wallace victory in Alabama? Politicians don't comment? Well, first of all, I suppose because it was to be expected. It's as Groucho Marx used to say in terms of the successful personality in the show business. He says, behind every successful man is a woman, and behind that woman is his wife. That's what Groucho Marx used to say. I saw Wallace in television, and I must tell you, not since Laurel and Hardy have I ever seen anything quite like it. Oh, listen, my dear, I venture to say that many things far more phenomenal can happen in the state of Alabama and Mississippi and in parts of Louisiana. We have not yet scratched the surface of idiocy in those areas. I'm sorry, I didn't hear. Well, I think the criticism probably came when it was first announced that dear Lurleen would run. And then the criticism, of course, was somewhat acidy because they realized that, unfortunately, Lurleen would probably win. And in the state of Alabama, a friend of mine who'd been there recently told me that if all Wallace would have really had to do was to, declare a holiday of the state government and close the state office building, and the electorate would go along with it. That they're for him. There are a group of politically conscious and oriented Alabamans who are somewhat more progressive, though not a hell of a lot, who took a dim view of this obvious sloughing off of a state constitutional law there. But nonetheless, they're totally impotent. They can't do a thing about it. But I tell you what I wish would happen, though, when he said in television that night. Did you all see that when Wallace got up? Brilliant kid. He thinks. And his wife is really nice, too. I really dug Lurleen. Christ. She sounds like a ship on its way to Honolulu, that girl. And I wish she would. But she said, the question was posed, I think, by the NBC guy that what does this mean, Governor, in terms of the possibility of your running in 1968? And George was, always with it. And George said, well, he said, there's no question, but that if indeed we discover that the atheists and the socialists and the communists, those are the three heavies that he always, it's would you want your daughter to marry? It's that kind of a cat out of the bag. It's the last fortress against logic that they dredge up, you see, the stave of the barrel. And he said, well, indeed, if they continue to control, the powers of government federally and nationally, I may well have to take a position with a third party. And my point is, I hope he does. Because what votes would George Wallace attract if in a sense we're dealing with a moderate candidate? He would detract from the right wing, who would elect whoever was the least moderate. And I think it would be a shoo-in for whoever was the most liberal of the candidates, if George Wallace could siphon off those kind of votes. Now, how many Americans fall into this category, I don't know. The Goldwater demise, of course, I thought at the time was somehow definitive. That 63% was it that went for Johnson. So oddly, there are only 37% idiots, who remain in the country, and that's a pretty reasonable breakdown, I think. If there are any Republicans in this room, I must be the most cordially hated guy. Yes, sir. Not anymore. Not anymore. I'm fishing. I'm retired. Indeed. I felt, for example, that the Reagan use of television was brilliant, if not inspired. It picked on that facet of the man which was the most sociable and the most attractive. It didn't ask him to answer probing questions. It showed him in those areas in which he was weakest but which needed strength. A factory, for example. And there he's shaking hands with the fella in the riveting machine, and the riveting machine guy is saying, God bless you, Ronnie. I loved you in King's Row, that kind of thing. And then there's another, then they show him in the Mexican area, oddly enough, again, an area of weakness. Most Negro, Chinese, Jewish, ethnic political grouping would, of necessity, have to be anti-Reagan. There he is, and being cheered with, Mexican language banners. And this is what they did very studiously and very carefully. And I must say that if I didn't know Ronnie Reagan, I came from Venus, say, and I landed here, and they say, this is the guy who's running for governor, and there he stands, 6'1", broad-shouldered, reasonably trim-waisted, at least more trim-waisted than Batman, let's put it that way. And he gets up and he says his few glib, reasonably uncombative kind of statements, non-combative kind of statements. I think to myself, well, this looks like a governor. I'd probably vote for the son of a gun. But his use of television, I thought, was most effective. Unfortunately, Brown didn't have the money, apart from, the lack of good planning. He simply didn't have the money to compete. Yes, sir. Dark glasses. Well, the question presupposes that many liberals refuse to comment on the Warren Report. Is this true? I'll take that under advisement without without submitting to it as being the fact. I'm not sure it is. However, the fact that I'm a liberal has nothing whatsoever to do with my refusal to comment. In point of fact, I'm just finishing the inquest book. I'm only about halfway through. I'm not sufficiently knowledgeable to make a comment on something whose ramifications are that basic and fundamental. I think the business of the Warren Report, indeed the projection of what might be the case if the Warren Report is incorrect or fallacious or improper, I think those ramifications are so basic and fundamental to the whole fabric of this country that I wouldn't just want to slough off with a quick answer to you. That's the whole reason for my not wanting to comment, because I haven't read all the material. Understand? Right. I'm not afraid, mind you. I'm not afraid. Okay. I'm petrified, actually. But go ahead. Well, Howard Fast would hate you to say he was a science fiction writer. Oh, politically, Howard Fast. Oh. Well, I'm not as far to the left, I suppose, as Howard Fast. I'm much more the middle roader in most areas. But most science fiction writers, I'm not as aware of their political stance as you seem to be. I know Ray Bradbury is very liberal, but I don't know whether Frederick Brown or Isaac Asimov or any of these people are liberally oriented. Are they? That they do suggest a liberal position? Well, I would guess I'm on a par liberally with most of them. I'm not as gutsy as Bradbury. First of all, Bradbury refuses to ride in an automobile, drive a car. That's for openers right there. And that's pretty liberal, man, I'll tell you. And the second thing is, during the McCarthy days, Ray Bradbury published a full-page ad in the Daily Variety in which he chastised Senator McCarthy. And in those days, it was rather unpolitic of one to do so. Now, I did a similar thing in Cincinnati, Ohio. But, it's a lot different in Cincinnati, Ohio. I was only making like $13 a week anyway, so, what could they take from me? But for Bradbury, in his position then, already accepted as a pretty reasonably high-level writer, it took some guts. But I presume most authors, most creative people, by and large, tend to side with the liberal forces. I think that's historically true, is it not? Yes, sir. My opinion of Vice President Humphrey. Now, mind you, when I respond this way, as glibly and as quickly as I do, I don't want you to presuppose that I believe I am necessarily wise and all-perceiving in all of this. As I mentioned on the platform, and that was no false humility, I'm probably less read than many of you. Hubert Humphrey, yeah. Well, I had lunch with Hubert Humphrey once, last summer. I was invited to the White House. I just wanted to drop that name while I was here. And I must tell you that was the most exciting thing in my whole life. I'd never met a president. And when the call came, call White House Operator 14, and I thought, the call, see? And then I thought to myself, Jesus, it's drafting. I'm going to get drafted. Because I was active reserves, one of those idiots that was in active reserve for 11 years, see? And I thought, oh God, they're bringing up the old men with the children now. But in point of fact, I sat with Humphrey, and I found him an articulate man, albeit somewhat talkative. I must tell you, again, I have to examine his positions in terms of his response to certain social problems. And over the years, the political stance of Hubert Humphrey is close to my own. I cannot explain what is his current, detraction from our ranks here in terms of the Vietnamese thing. Obviously, it's politically expedient to do precisely what he's doing. If he were to turn around and make a speech at the Kiwanis Club in Minneapolis and say, Lyndon Johnson, you ass, what are you doing? I think we would have seen the last of Hubert Humphrey within 50 miles of Washington, see? So I presume, I think the criticism that most liberals level at him is that, all right, he may tacitly and quietly go along without saying anything, but why, indeed, must he run around the country in vocal support of same? And I don't understand it. I don't know. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Saying, I believe that they had no viable proposal. First of all, I wonder if you really read what Robert Scheer said, and if in fact you really object mainly to their boycotting the election.
I objected to the boycott in the election because I thought it unrealistic. I don't believe that it's proper to dismiss a candidate because one of the basic issues that he believes in is in variance to your own, when in point of fact all along the rest of the spectrum he believes pretty much as you believe. And so by boycotting the election, you automatically guarantee the election of a man who is absolutely the antithesis of everything you believe. Now this to me seemed unrealistic. My jab at the New Left was not a militant, disregard of any validity in your point of view or in your stance or in your beliefs or in your fundamental philosophy. I understand the motivation of the New Left. I do think, and have always felt, that in their preoccupation with LSD and, the bearded marching and the rest of it, that there's a great deal of noise with perhaps on occasion insufficient substance. I hear an awful lot of screaming and crying for issues which I don't think are of the essence at the moment. For example, to me, LSD is not the issue. And why the hell would you march for 6.5 hours so you can get a syringe stuck in your fanny? There are many more things important. That's what I'm trying to say. I think if you want to march in terms of, Negro rights or something like this, it's absolutely correct. But some of the things which you use as, as the symbols of freedom that you cry for, I don't think really are of the essence. But I obviously am not as well read in this, and I didn't mean to, slough off the New Left at all. You're mad, aren't you? No, I was not. And I could have learned a lot, I'm sure. Yes, sir. I think it's a sir. I only see a hand. It's a ma'am. Hello, madam. Would you repeat that? I'm sorry. The University of Oregon. Yeah. I call that pretty gutsy, don't you? I'm serious. I'm serious. I must tell you, of course, I wouldn't have that kind of guts. I would not have the guts, for example, to burn a draft card. And though I may not be able to sympathize with those who do, I well understand why they would. My concern about draft card burning and lying down on railroad tracks, in front of munitions trains, I think is well motivated. But again, I think in a sense this is a dismissal of law and order again. And needless to say, my sympathies go out because I understand and rather sympathize with their point of view. But it opens up vast vistas of dangerous projections. What if the far right decides, for example, that the law is improper and that current proprieties are unimportant, and they go ahead and do it? And what do you have happen then? Carloads of guys in New Jersey with grenades who are doing exactly the same thing according to their lights as we do when we burn draft cards. They're spitting at the law, just as we do. I simply submit to you that there has to be basic law. See? And that's not in response to your question, I know. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Go ahead. Well, I didn't. Go ahead. You're quite right. The question, of course, was that I took the position militantly that the two aspects of the civil rights things that I dislike so much, and that though I didn't like looting, I sympathize with it. But, what else do we do? You're asking for a concrete example. I think the Head Start program, I think the poverty program, I think a deep and conscious and constant awareness of what are the causes of Watts and Harlem and Atlanta should represent pretty much 50% of our government preoccupation these days. And I think we should pour money into it and experts into it and dedicated government people into it with far-reaching plans and keep on doing it. Currently, you mean? Not when it costs $2 billion every 3 months to process a war in Vietnam. I don't agree with that at all. I think that's a waste of money. What would 10% of that money do to this college campus in terms of allowing more students to study and give you an extra library and 3 more books a year to read? All right. I thought that was kind of a popular comment, but I take it back. I suggest that the government continue in precisely the manner that they've begun, and also on city and local and state levels as well. Keep going into Watts. Get these job starting things begun. Ultimately, they are a step in the right direction, my dear, because once you make people economically sound, you take them off the streets and their children go to school, and that begins the cycle. I realize this is an oversimplification, but to all point intent here, I think it suffices. Education certainly is the thing, but nobody is going to give a damn whether their children go to school or not if they haven't got 3 squares a day and a decent place to live, and the assurance of economic security. Yes, sir. Forgot your question, huh? The news is controlled by the government? Some news, I'm sure, probably is. News from the front, so they say. I can remember once, for example, you forgive the old soldiers, we have this thing. I remember once we were on an island called Lady Island. Take notes, kids. And we were trapped up there for like 31 days, and 8 days without chow. That's food. Chow. And so one of the things dropped us via air was the copy of the Pacific Stars and Stripes, with a big front page article with Douglas MacArthur's official statement that the fighting in Leyte had come to an end. And I remember thinking, this is obviously the garbage that's going to be sent back home. And people are going to think, why did my kid get killed on Thursday when on a previous Monday they'd stopped fighting? This kind of thing. I rather imagine there is a collection of euphemisms which apply to Army communiques. I think they apply in most wars. As to certain basic and more fundamental political problems as handled by the news media, I'm sure the government too softens and somehow discolors. I rather think so. But by and large, we've got as free a press as I think exists. Yes, sir? I don't know. I swear to God, I'm hung up on that one. You think we should? I just don't know. I think in principle we shouldn't be there. My problem here is a more realistic one. How do we get out? That's the question. And you say pull out, and I'm sure a lot of people subscribe to that. I just don't know what would be the result of an immediate pull out. What, for example, would the North Vietnamese do to the South Vietnamese, or et cetera, et cetera? I'm not supporting either side at the moment. My feeling is that it's a civil war, plain and simple, and that our presence there was erroneous to begin with. And if indeed, as a matter of principle, we will run into any country in which there is the possibility of a communist takeover, we've got an awful lot of work ahead of us. Or indeed, if we subscribe to even deeper principle and say, as many of the right-wingers would have us believe, that we should go into Cuba because the poor Cubans, languish in political jails. And if this is the principle to espouse, there are 13 South American countries where political people languish in jails. They happen to be put there by the right rather than the left, but the principle remains the same. If we indeed are going to fight for world freedom on a global scale, I think we might as well all leave college and put on the uniforms, because this is a 150-year war. Only fools multiply folly. I agree with you, but I'm only suggesting here, on a political level, how do you simply take your troops out of Vietnam? Well, this is another big can of peas. But I think it's immoral that we are there to begin with. I will say that to that extent. Yes, sir. Well, I'm rich to begin with. You don't think I'd work for this honorarium for, no, in point of fact, the series, the demise of the series didn't help, let's put it that way. But I've been pretty fatigued by television anyway, and television indeed has been pretty fatigued by me too. I've gotten to reach the point where when I walked into my network, which was CBS, it was like going into a lion's den, really an arena of combat in which I would scream at them and they would scream at me. And then I would go and make a public statement as to what was said to me, and they would deny it. And in point of, again, once they called me in last September, or a year ago September, and I had a Western on the air at the time. It was called The Loner. And I didn't know how alone this guy was until I saw the ratings on that show. All alone. And they had called me in and told me that they'd gotten 100 people off the street to watch the show. They just literally pulled them in before the series went on to look at one of the representative film samples. And the audience of 100 people hated the show because, they said, there was no good guy, quote, and no bad guy, and there was no shooting. And that this was a Western, and by God, what right did we have, to impose upon, the traditional Western, with a big peaceful motif there. And the guy, Mr. Dan, said, what we need is more violence. And he said it, quote, what we need is more violence, unquote. And I made the statement to the press that Mr. Dan of CBS said we have more violence. And, it hit the fan. Mr. Dan denied he'd ever said it. And my own partner, Mr. Dozier, who currently operates Batman, went on the podium himself and said, I never heard Mr. Dan say such a thing. And I suddenly felt, I'm all alone here, and my memory has failed me totally. But I just find it, I finally wrote a Broadway play, a pacifistic play. And I wanted to do it for years and years. I've had it in my mind. Every writer, I think, worth his salt, aspires to something other than what he is doing. The novelist wants to write the play. The screenwriter wants to write the novel, etc., etc. I think it's the normal progression. And I've always wanted to write the play. And last Friday, after it had been turned down 15 places, it got finally sold. And the producers are currently doing this, the investigation, the Auschwitz thing on Broadway. And they're going to try this. They've lost money in every venture they've had, and this should be no different, I'm sure. But, it's, what you want to do. But no more TV. It's backbreaking. Yes, sir. I think the whole documentary approach of the news and documentary departments of most major networks are probably the most enlightened and the most adult and the most creative of all of their counterparts in TV. I think back, for example, at some of the NBC white papers and some of the CBS reports, and the question as to censorship, for example, was broached a moment ago. The last thing I saw in Vietnam by CBS I thought was pretty damn revealing of a negative point of view. And they laid it on the line. And I thought, far from being censored, this was as honest and as objective a report as I'd seen. But I happen to feel that in the area of documentary and news, the networks are by far at their best. Yes, sir. Yes. There's no question, but that's true, and that's unfortunate. But I think it represents principally a fact of life, that there is no footage available on the Viet Cong side. I venture to say, for example, if the CBS News Department got some film footage of a Viet Cong speaking in English, and indeed bespeaking his views on the current conflict, they would put it on the air. I don't question that for a moment. If I'm wrong, kill me. But I really believe that's true. And I, for example, would love to hear what is the Viet Cong position. I'd like to know what those guys think. I don't know. That's one of the reasons, why I shy away, from the very specific position of let's get out of there. I want to know who the enemy is, and I just don't know. I just want to take this fellow.
Why did that statement about the news media about television, how they handle the situation? What do you feel about their endorsement of a certain party? I know you appeared on KNXT and were puzzled.
Oh, I believe they should endorse political parties so long as the equal time law is effectively utilized. But the equal time law, in terms you're referring to the Robert Wood statement on KNXT, in which she takes a position on the part of the station that they support the candidacy of Ronald Reagan and Robert Finch. Well, now the equal time law calls for an equivalent amount of time in which the opposite view can be so stated. But the equal time law also carries with it an obligation that not the individual appear, but a representative. In other words, Anderson could not respond himself personally. He had to send a representative, who unfortunately was old Rod. And you know, they could have picked a much better guy, because I really couldn't conjure up vast enthusiasm for Glenn Anderson. I've never met the man. They call him the quiet fighter. I'll say he's quiet. He's quiet. He's invisible. You know, he's non-existent. You know, I always wonder, is there really a Glenn Anderson? He's alive and hiding in Burbank someplace. I don't know. But that was the problem there, because then, of course, the station says that if indeed Anderson comes to respond, then the Republicans in turn have a right, and it becomes a whole vicious cycle. The equal time thing then goes into effect, and, you know, 90% of the programming are rebuttal and argument. But I don't question the right of a TV station to espouse an editorial opinion any more than I do newspapers. So long as they give the opposing side an equal time, I mean really, quote, equal time, unquote, exclamation point, yes, I don't, and so long as they so label it as an editorial opinion. I would much prefer Robert Wood doing it than that sucker on Channel 5 6 nights a week. You know, the guy that turns sideways to you and waves the American flag, this studied, mannered imbecile who introduced Max Rafferty last night as our enlightened, articulate, progressive superintendent of whatever the hell he is. What's his name? What's that guy's name? Putnam. Are you listening to us, Putnam? No, and this guy, under the guise of the objective reporter, he manages to somehow snidely insert every political view of his own, which is continuously on the right side. So I would much rather prefer, you know, if we're going to have it, let's label it. Not this business of giving a newscast and deliberately weighting it on whatever side he personally feels. Yes, sir. I reject censorship in principle, on any level, in any state, in any way. And I ask only one question, and it has been asked by every writer since the beginning of time. Why no censorship? Because I want to know who the hell is going to do the censoring. You know, Senator James Eastland of Mississippi just pushed a bill through the state legislature in his state, you know, in which they had the right to review any book or movie, you know, that went through the docket in the state of Mississippi to decide whether or not it was obscene. Well, by God, I'd hate like hell to have Jimmy Eastland. I call him Jimmy, you know. I'd be desperately afraid of what standard of judgment he would apply to what is profane and what is, you know, subversive. So, in principle, I reject censorship because I don't believe anybody's wise enough to know what's proper to censor. Yes, sir. Yeah, I think potentially it could be damaging, as it occurred, for example, in 1964, when they were announcing if indeed the Goldwater-Johnson campaign had been very close, and the Eastern projection at 6 o'clock in the evening would have been a Johnson smash, and that would have materially affected the number of voters going out here. They figure, first of all, the Democrats think, well, what the hell? If it's a big smash, why waste the time? Why go out in the rain? And the Republicans think the same thing. You know, it won't do us any good. Meanwhile, that election could get close someplace between the Rockies, and those voters who had defected by not going, you know, could very materially affect the outcome. In that case, of course, it didn't, because it was a landslide. But I noticed, for example, that in the Eastern election results, they did not announce any California projections until 7:25 or 7:35, deliberately waiting until most of the polls had closed. Yes, ma'am. Oh, simply by virtue of their own words. The Proposition 16 proponents had radio spots on the air in which they kept talking about the decent, law-abiding Americans who don't like violence in their streets and don't like pornography in their home. And then, as a matter of fact, they related that Proposition 16 to the attempt on the part of these same people to kick out 3 of the state justices, including the Supreme Court, including the Chief Justice. The two spots were identical, and they were very interrelated. Does that answer your question? Still not. Well, what I'm suggesting here is that these people were the same people that kept talking about violence in the streets. And read your Bruin today. One of the columnists made mention of the fact that, boy, when they talk violence in the streets, they don't mean violence in the streets, they mean Negro riots. And when they talk about law-abiding Americans, they don't mean law-abiding Americans, they mean white law-abiding Americans. And the implication is quite clear. Only in terms of the way they publicized that anti-obscenity amendment, because they kept relating it to decent, God-fearing Americans who hate violence in the streets and indeed hate obscenity. They made the connection themselves, the people who supported it. On the face of it, anti-obscenity, of course, has no relationship to race relations, but they indeed made it so themselves, the proponents. Yes, ma'am.
Excuse me, before you start, we'll have time for about 2 or 3 more questions.
I'll grant you what you say is true, but then I ask you to re-examine what is the political climate in the state of California. Pat Brown made one public statement that was quite militant and quite explicit in terms of his personal feeling about capital punishment. He said he felt that it was immoral and improper, and in point of fact didn't respond to any of the problems that really motivated capital punishment being brought to the fore in the first place. This was the extent of what he said. He didn't militantly fight for it, you're quite right. But at least he made the position known. Had Pat Brown gone down the line during an election and said one of the issues which I address myself to is capital punishment and I'm against it, he loses X number of votes that way. I'm just suggesting that there is a certain reality to politicking. And perhaps you're right, you students. You know, you're younger than I am, and you can still subscribe to certain idealistic tones that I, because I'm older and beaten, I don't. But there are certain realities that we have to face. One of them is that if a man fights for an issue which he knows the general public rejects, he automatically kills himself. My point in my response to this young man and to you is that rather Brown, who I know once in office will probably address himself to my side of the fight on most issues, rather him than the other guy who I know is militantly opposed to everything I believe in. Just call it the lesser of evils syndrome if you like. But I would much prefer going with the lesser of evils than the known evil. That's all I'm saying. How about integrity? I know that too, but perhaps Glory Sherman ran because he knew he didn't want to lose. No, he couldn't win, and maybe did it. I respect Sherman. I contributed to the campaign. My kind of guy. I wish to Christ he could win. But he couldn't win. And he couldn't win because of the nature of the positions he took. Now, what about integrity? I'll grant you that somehow has flown from the scene. All I'm suggesting is that in this state of California, sometimes compromise a little when it's incumbent upon you to do so that you can serve in a position where you don't have to compromise. Let's get in the house and then change the furniture. But don't take the positions, at the absolute exclusion of reality that by their very nature deny you entrance into the house. That's what I'm saying. I know you don't accept that, and I'm not throwing that out, as the wisdom of the age. You're right and I'm wrong. Believe me, I think integrity should be of the essence. But in the state of California, where do you go with it? Because you won't get into public office with it, that's for damn sure. Yes, sir.
We'll have one more. This will be the last question.
Okay. Obscenity does not have the right to exist. Well, I disagree with that because I want to know what standard of judgments apply as to what literally is pornography. I don't know. I think anything is acceptable, and if indeed, this injures the sensitive feelings of parents, if these are sex magazines, plain and simple, and if they can materially hurt the fabric of the child's upbringing, etc., let the parents be responsible. Don't let the kids hide it inside their school books and take it up into the bedroom. It's the parents' responsibility. Because I think the projection of censorship as a principle is the dangerous thing. Pretty soon it's not just the sex magazines that are up for grabs. Then it becomes the commentative magazine of the political scene, which somehow has been permissive of a dirty play, say, being printed, etc. There goes Leroy Jones. There goes this guy. There goes that guy. And pretty soon there goes George Bernard Shaw. And invariably that's the way it works. And it works traditionally in every country in which there has been a loss of freedom. Where does it begin? It begins in news media, in public print, in books, and on the proscenium. That's where they attack you first, right there. That's the breadbasket. Understand? But you disagree with me. I'll meet you outside. I think that's about it. Right? Who? Yeah, okay.
On behalf of all of us here, I think all of you will join me in thanking Mr. Serling for his sitting here and really taking it.